The first thing I want to say, and this is a very common experience for me, is that I am a practitioner, and this is terribly important to me in how I think about my historical writing. I'm a practitioner first, a historian somewhere in the middle and in parallel, and a practitioner subsequently. I left teaching, I am unaffiliated, not because I don't love teaching, I love teaching, but because I cannot abide institutional structure. And so I think that my entire approach to the historical is very much through the filter of the experiential. That being said, this is going to be a very historical talk. I'm really excited to follow directly after Dushka because she touched on the content that I don't have time for today. I will be speaking in fairly broad strokes about a number of major movements which happen over a period of about 120 years. And I will not be able to get into the details, the wonderful details of how individual companies actually worked. I think that when we speak about collective creation and devising, there are three large categories we can speak of. One is, what are the methods being utilized in the rehearsal room? By the way, how is my audibility? Am I good? Okay. What are the methods being used in the rehearsal room? What are the structures, institutional structures of making? So, what are the, we could say, the politics of the groups themselves? And what are the broader sort of socio-political frameworks that may be inspiring those political institutional structures? And that's what I'm going to be talking about primarily today, is this relationship between how groups conceive of themselves, their own internal politics, and the kind of the methods of group work in relationship to larger political frames. This is very much an overview. I should also say that this overview is coming out of my books, and that if you are interested in the details, these were edited volumes, so there is a lot of detail. Each chapter focuses on a particular company and a particular set of practices. So the details that are missing from the talk, you will find them in the books. The group, not the individual, writes Theodore Schenk at the opening of his 1972 article, Collective Creation, is the typical focus of an alternative society. In the 1960s and 1970s, decades marked in so many Western nations by utopic yearning, the theater, as elsewhere, became a site of society building. And in the alternative theaters of North America, Australia, parts of Latin America, and Europe, the group was ascendant. Collective creation, the practice of collaboratively devising works of performance, rose to prominence, not simply as a performance-making method, but as an institutional model. This period was the heyday of the living theater, years that saw the nascence of France's Théâtre du Soleil, the agitprop street players in England, El Teatro Campesino in the fields of Southern California, English Canada's Théâtre Passe-Muraille, and Quebec's Théâtre E. Companies associated variously with collective performance creation, egalitarian labor distribution, consensual decision-making, and socio-political revolt. The prominence of collective creation in the alternative theaters of the 60s and 70s has, with time, led to a kind of vague sense that collective creation, along with sex, drugs, youth culture, sprang more or less fully grown, like Dionysus, from the thigh of 1968. This conflation derives from early historicization of collective theater making, such as we find in Mark S. Weinberg's seminal work, Challenging the Hierarchy, Collective Theater in the United States, written in 1992. For Weinberg, hacking a path through what was still a largely uncharted terrain of theater history, and I would add here, it remains an uncharted terrain of theater history. There is very little meaningful historical writing about these practices. Our books were making a stab at that and laying the groundwork for further investigation, but a lot of the historical work tends to look at fairly bounded historical periods within a particular place. So the broader work of creating a theater history around group practices, to my mind, remains to be done, and is an exhilarating field, because we could keep going way back in time, and we could rewrite the entire history of how theater is actually made. Just a thought. So for Weinberg, hacking that path through what was still a largely uncharted terrain of theater history, collective creation and the social and political upheaval of 1960s America were virtually synonymous. Quote, "The generation of the 60s led this movement as part of its theatricalization of political life and its use of theater as a weapon in its political struggles. But the 60s are hardly the only era in which human beings have entertained utopic longings for a more perfect social union. Nor are they the only time that alternative theater companies have yearned not merely for more cooperative modes of work, but to hold in their daily practices of work and collegial interaction to a higher standard of interpersonal relations, to make of the artistic group a model for a better way of being together in the world, a space in which to enact with a few like-minded collaborators a backstage performance of a more civil society, or, failing that, a refuge from an oppressive socio-political landscape." The conflation of collective creation with 60s counterculture and new left politics has resulted in a tendency to read early 21st century devising practices, which were frequently cited as less politically motivated than their predecessors, as a rejection of, or failure in terms of, the theatrical politics of the 60s. An alternative framing simply divorces contemporary devising from its antecedents, giving rise to ruptured histories of practice. Such temporarily and culturally bounded reading negates a rich tradition of collective practices of other types in other countries, in other eras, preceding, running parallel to, and following from their more visible 1960s counterparts. Between 2010 and 2016, I developed a series of 3 edited volumes aiming to trace collective creation models and practices and politics from 1900 into the contemporary period. While the aim of these books was to tease out the threads of a global network of transmission and influence, the resulting work was heavily oriented toward Europe and North America due to the interests and focus of Anglophone scholars of the period. Much work remains to be done, investigating the implications of global devising traditions beyond the framework of these volumes. Scholar Nia Witherspoon, for instance, whose work appears in the second book, has argued in private conversation that it is culturally antithetical to apply the term collective creation to an investigation of African diasporic performance traditions, since many of the source cultures, West African cultures for instance, do not conceptualize performance creation in terms of individual artistry. Creation is inherently multiple. And I think here there's something I just want to address that was really quite lovely in what Dushka brought up about the director who resists the notion of authorship, and is that false modesty. If you function in a hierarchical space, very aware of the ecology, the energies, the dynamic lines of exchange of that space, which are untrackable, and you are attuned to that, I think that modesty is pretty organic. You don't know who said what when. You don't know the source of your ideas. You don't know at what point you came into a room with something that you let go and somebody else shifted you, or you shifted them, or we all shifted each other. That's not modesty. I think that's sensitivity. Nonetheless, we were able to unearth rich networks of transmission that laid the groundwork for further scholarship in the field and reframed the historicization of collective creation practices. What our collective research, and it was very much collective, we worked on the books from a collective creation perspective, that there would be polyphony, there would be disagreement, we would not come to some kind of, we were not looking for consensus, we were looking for the interweave. What our collective research revealed above all is that the political and methodological aims and perspectives of the groups studied are richly variegated. Such perspectives include, and are by no means limited to, the proposition that a collectively devised mise en scène for an existing dramatic work might constitute a form of collective creation, depending on how it's done. That collaboration, if collaboration is presumed to equal discussion, debate, and subsequent accord, acquiescence, or synthesis, is not the sole basis for collective work. That collective creation might accommodate authorial or directorial leadership in an asymmetry of relations, and I think that Dushka covered a great deal of that very richly. That conversely, commercialization of collective practices in contemporary devising in the US, perhaps also British contexts, and the attendant abandonment of radical democratic institutional structures constitutes a betrayal of the most deeply held principles of a long-standing tradition. In other words, you have arguments within the history, right? That the New Left's aspiration to leaderlessness is but one of many possible political models that have underpinned radical collective theatrical practice, that historically, instances of collective practice have served conservative as well as radical impulses, that the very concept of a collective may be problematized and broadened by contemporary philosophical challenges to the concept of an individuated self. In our study, we chose to focus above all on companies that have themselves defined their own processes as collective creation. So if a company said, we're collectively creating, that's what we looked at. And then we went a little beyond. And to explore how that self-definition manifests in practice. We found that as a result of this methodology, in combination with a broadened cultural and historical field, the ex nihilo model kind of vanishes quickly from view as the defining factor. So too do New Left politics, leaving understandings of the term collective creation that are very much contextual, defined by the time, place, and group in which the term is used. Our work suggested that typically, notions of collective creation emerge in response to some prior mode of theater making, felt by a particular group of theater artists, by a particular theater artist or group of theater artists to be aesthetically, interpersonally, and or politically constraining, oppressive, or in some manner simply unethical. That is, a given understanding and method of collective creation is frequently defined against past experience, and those past experiences are frequently extremely specific. For Vsevolod Meyerhold, for instance, collective creation, as he defined it, and he's one of the first writers about the theater to use the term коллективное творчество, as he defined it in 1906, constituted a specific response to the methods of the Moscow Art Theater as he had experienced them between 1898 and 1903. The perceived aesthetic tyranny that lay at the core of Meyerhold's impulse to engage the group in a more collaborative process was not that of the writer or of the literary work, but of a particular mode of ensemble, which Meyerhold believed was constraining the idiosyncratic expressivity of the individual performer. The resulting alternative methodology thus focused on the collective generation of mise en scène rather than the collective generation of a playtext. The political yearnings that fueled that particular experiment were likewise specific to their place, Moscow, and their political moment, 6 months of revolutionary upsurge and its suppression, unfolding between early spring and late autumn of 1905. Contested notions of group and leader, to which Meyerhold and his collaborators give voice, bear the distinctive imprint of that particular cultural tumult, and bear little resemblance to the concerns voiced by, let's say, members of the Living Theatre in the United States circa 1968. Taking such examples as the basis for our understanding, we find that the question, was there a play in the room before everybody got started, becomes instead, what is it that a particular collective perceives as extrinsic to their creative process? What is it that a particular group chooses to contest, change, or reveal through collective practice? As we trace collective creation back in time, we find not only a proliferation of variegated social and political impulses, but also a distinctly extra-political impetus. Early 20th century collectives, much like their 21st century counterparts, have been jolted into being as often out of aesthetic impulse as political. By way of a working definition of collective creation, this seems to leave something very simple. There's a group. The group wants to make theater. The group, or dance, and I don't touch a lot in dance here, though it is touched upon in these volumes. The group chooses, or conversely, a leader within the group proposes, to make theater using a process that places conscious emphasis on the groupness of that process, or on some possible collaborative mode between members of the group, which is typically viewed as being in some manner more collaborative than members of the group have previously experienced. Processes typically of paramount importance, anticipated aesthetic or political outcomes are perceived to derive directly from the proposed mode of interaction. Processual method may well be ideologically driven insofar as, historically at least, collaborative creation has often constituted a kind of polemic in action against prior methodologies that the group has known, an investigation, a reinvigoration, a challenge, or an overthrow. The extrinsic or oppressive structure, if you will, that the group perceives itself to be challenging through the generation of a new methodology may be aesthetic, institutional, interpersonal, societal, economic, political, ethical, or some admixture thereof. Victor Turner's theories on the relationship between performativity and social structure offer some useful constructs for formulating a more inclusive articulation of the tendencies of collective creation. In his introduction to Turner's Anthropology of Performance, Richard Schechner reminds us that Turner taught that there was a continuous process of linking performative behavior, art, sports, ritual, play, with social and ethical structure, the way people think about and organize their lives and specific individual and group values, unquote. Building on Turner's formulations, we might think of collective creation as straddling the threshold between the performativity of social life and performance as such, positing that collective creation foregrounds the creative action of social and ethical structuring in a dynamic interplay with the creative action of performance making. That theater should lend itself to such an encounter seems to be a very logical outgrowth of the dialectical play between drama's traditional concern with the social and the intrinsically social nature of making and sharing drama. Viewed in this light, the particular politics of particular collectives become subsumed into a spectrum of possible socio-ethical impulses and outcomes, collective creation appearing less as a manifestation of any one ideological position than as a genre of performance making that positions itself at the intersection of social and aesthetic action. And here I just want to reference a conversation from the other conference where we were talking a little bit about the writing of Paul Preciado, And Christina brought up the fact that in Paul Preciado's philosophy about structures of power, one very important principle is the notion that structures morph, they change, they shift, they are not fixed. And I think when we look back at the history of collective creation, there's a kind of modesty that arises because what we think must be done is not what people thought 10 years earlier and 10 years before that and so on. There is a continual morphing within the history of the practice, which I think it is important to historiographically honor and recognize. Even this expanded notion of the ideological may prove insufficiently inclusive, for of course, not all devising groups seek to contest, subvert, or overthrow an extant system, be it political, economic, or artistic. Some employ the tools of collective creation simply to create new theatrical forms or works through new artistic means. And indeed, as collective performance evolves in the 21st century, even a notion of new forms and methods is very much in play. As devising companies emerge with increasing frequency from devising workshops, devising programs, devising schools, creating collectively becomes less a polemical exploration than a known alternative within an array of current possible practices. The advantage of broadening our understanding of collective creation is that it allows us to better historicize a confluence of relationships and practices, drawing into the historical map companies whose influence on international devising practice has been considerable, and yet which, as a result of apparent apolitical or non-egalitarian practices, have been marginalized or even written out of the history of collective creation. A theme which came up the other day, Wojtek, you were speaking about this, is this thorny question, do we include Grotowski and that lineage when we talk about the history of collective practice? I would argue that we do, while recognizing the authoritarianism in the room. In particular, this approach permits consideration of influential figures more typically associated with authoritarian auteurism, for example, Meyerhold or Jacques Copeau, as well as other figures who might better conform to the model of an actor-centered director, but who certainly do not fit within the model of 1960s egalitarian institutional structure. Stanislavski, Michel Saint-Denis, Jerzy Grotowski, Eugenio Barba, for example. Thus broadening the definition of collective practice produces new tools for better unearthing instances of collectively generated performance in companies which make no claim to such methods. And here, for example, we might think of the highly problematic work of Garcinica. For just as we may find authoritarianism lurking beneath the surface of an egalitarian rhetoric, and this was a big problem in the 60s. This was a big problem, for example, with the work of Julian Beck and I just blanked on her name, of the Living Theatre, of Judith Malina and Julian Beck. For just as we may find authoritarianism lurking beneath the surface of an egalitarian rhetoric, we may find ample examples of collaborative devising lurking beneath the surface of directorial dominance. In broadening our definition to include companies whose relationship to egalitarian ethos falls somewhere along the spectrum between tenuous and non-existent, are we watering down a political history? I don't think so. I think that what we're doing is in fact politicizing our historical writing by better according creative attribution where attribution is due. Broad recognition of the multiform manifestations of collective creation has far-reaching implications for how we write the history of theater practices, how we archive its traces. I mean, when we're writing actors back into history and their contributions, that very simple thing, when we're writing women back into the history of theater making, if we are not looking at the collective nature of many actual rehearsal room practices and how those are subsumed under authorship, then we cannot do the work of unearthing hidden histories of labor. And, of course, implications for how we teach acting, directing, design, playwriting, theater making. Our research suggests that modern collective creation might usefully be understood as having evolved in three overlapping waves. The first spans the first half of the 20th century, following rapidly on the heels of the emergence of the modern director, and arising from an often contradictory array of aesthetic, political, and social impulses. These include the search for the total artwork, necessitating new models of collaboration with designers, composers, and writers, as well as an actor capable of conceiving her work within a collective mise-en-scène, possessing, in other words, a directorial choreographic sensibility. They also include the modernist fascination with popular, often physical theater traditions, especially mime, vaudeville, and commedia dell'arte, forms generated by performer creators. I want to touch on something that you said about censorship and the dominance of the script. This is running through this history between about 1900 and 1968 as different countries start to loosen and eventually let go of their censorship rules, although, of course, we could argue that with neoliberalism that comes back in the structure of the institution. And if you go back to the film Children of Paradise, you can see the historicization in that film of the role of the mime as a subversive figure, because the mime does not work with text and no one can come in and censor what is happening. And there is a deep history of this within the formation of collective creation in the modernist period. Institutional inspirations were likewise diverse and included models of group interaction at once collective and hierarchical, such as Catholic and Russian Orthodox monasticism and Soviet communism. Political impulses, too, varied from the anti-monarchist turn in pre-revolutionary Russia to Bolshevik collectivism less than 2 decades later. Progressive protest in Depression-era United States, Polish national identity articulation following the collapse of the Russian Empire and the defeat of Austria and Prussia in World War I, competing forces of nationalism and anti-fascism in interwar France, communist leanings among the German left of the Weimar period. The second wave, spanning from the mid-1950s into the early 1980s, was marked. By the way, I want to add here that Joan Littlewood is a fascinating figure because she spans both eras. So Littlewood is coming out of this 1930s, 1940s fascination with workers' theater in its kind of earlier period, the kind of theater practice that will, in the 60s, inform people like Lushkin and gets reinvestigated in the current period. And then she takes that into her ideas of how she makes theater, and it becomes a more authorial theater. So what you find in a lot of authorial directorial practice is these earlier histories of group work that then become, one might say, co-opted, branded, and owned. The second wave, spanning from the mid-1950s into the early 1980s, was marked in its most prominent manifestations by the utopic communitarian ethos, anti-authoritarianism, and Marxist-inflected politics of the generation of '68. In non-communist states, e.g. France, America, Canada, and England, it was informed too by aesthetic possibilities arising from developments in avant-garde dance, music, and the visual arts. This is the period of collective creation associated with the striving toward fully participatory artistic democracy and the leaderless ensemble. The third wave can be said to have begun in the early 1980s and continues into the present moment, although I would argue that things are happening right now that are outside the framework of this original study, which was completed about 10 years ago. In the main, the third wave appears to be post-utopic, I think that's changing, dominated by an ethical imperative over the ideological, and an interest in the generative creativity of the actor. I do think that the ethical imperative versus the ideological imperative is a very important notion for the present time. And I think we can look at movements such as, forgive me, I'm blanking again, the anti-structural, anti-authoritarian movement of the early 2000s that spread across the globe. Somebody help me out here. The Occupy movement. When we think about Occupy and subsequent social movements that resisted a clear ideological structure of group organization, we could argue that something similar is reflected in contemporary devising investigations in many groups and many places. It is impelled above all by the development and ever-widening dissemination of pedagogies of collective creation and actor-generated performance, emerging in the United States context, in particular from Grotowski's brief tenure in the US, successive waves of graduates from l'École Jacques Lecoq, and workshop tours conducted by Théâtre du Soleil and America's City Company. It is spurred too by intermediality and resurgent interest in theater as total artwork. Economic realities of recent decades has given it renewed impetus. And here I would definitely refer to the work of Alex Mermikides, who has been writing about this now for several decades. Moving through these three phases of development, our first two volumes on collective creation and devising tease out what may be the most significant contradictory strand running counter to the thematic structure proposed in this chronology. The artistic lineage that runs from the nascent experiments in collective creation of Meyerhold and Stanislavski, through the companies of Reduta in Poland, Grotowski, Barba, and more recently, the Work Center of Jerzy Grotowski and Thomas Richards. These are artists whose group practices rejected political ideologies as such, and for whom the concern with group dynamics is marked not by an ideal of leaderlessness. To the contrary, there is often an ideal of the guru, but by the centrality of the actor in the creative act. In conclusion, we proposed the proto-collective creation model, conceived by Meyerhold and further developed by Stanislavski, has come full circle over the course of the century, re-emerging in dominant trends of contemporary practice, at least in the United States, and it appears in much of Europe as well, with their emphasis on accommodated leadership, ethical group process, and the centrality of the actor-creator. Much has happened in devising since I concluded that phase of my research in 2016 with the publication of my third book, Women, Collective Creation and Devised Theatre, Towards a New History of Women in the Modern Theatre. With the flare-up of autocracies around the world and fear for the future of the democratic project, we may be perhaps witnessing a return of the 1960s ethos in modified form, as young people in particular search for new dynamics of group interaction and new modes of grappling with the problem of power in their creative practices. The current Polish context of devised theatre is a new one, like the very recent Greek collective creation movement described by Dimitrios Pampilos at the Katowice conference. And it offers, I think, a rich terrain of study, which has implications for developments in other parts of the world. I want very much to thank you for this opportunity to share my work in this field. I would like to think that the historical and analytic framework that I just laid out, as well as the wealth of detail encompassed in these 3 volumes from a decade ago, can contribute a paradigm for thinking forward into what is happening with collectively created performance in the present and what may be to come. Thank you.